I begin this series tonight with a lecture examining how Russia has intruded on the American Jewish imagination. We move in my second talk to the early 20th century Russian Pale of Settlement, where transcripts of Jewish teachers' meetings provide us an entree to revisit the rhetoric of Cheder reform and more broadly designations of cultural authenticity in late imperial Russian Jewry. In my third lecture, I evaluate alternate beginnings to the writing of the cultural history of the Jews in Russia, specifically in the Black Sea metropolis Odessa. What, as I see it, are the threads that hold these talks together? All are, broadly speaking, historiographical. At their core, a preoccupation with the rewriting of the Russian Jewish past. They rely, of course, on very different sources. Staccato voices of Jewish teachers in archival transcripts, elsewhere fiction, plays, etc. Still, in a field of historical research, on the verge of what is almost certain major change, historians of Russian Jewry have only started to draw in the last 3 or 4 years on archival material in the former USSR, inaccessible for much of the century. There is a need, I think, to step back and reflect on current configurations of past. A fourth, final chapter of the book I expect to emerge from these lectures will be devoted to capturing broadly what it is that we as historians now feel we know about this past, perhaps also what we might likely learn in the future. Another theme of these lectures, linked closely to their historiographical concerns, is the wages of nostalgia and their role in shaping perceptions of Russian Jews over the last century. Throughout, I'm interested in examining the scaffolding just beneath the surface in historical work, the backdrop to the historical imagination as it relates to the immediate past in Russian Jewry, what it means to write history today, what it has meant over the last century since Russian Jews were first thought of in a coherent historical framework. Near the opening of Isaac Rosenfeld's 1946 novel, Passage from Home, a Jewish adolescent in Chicago takes us to his family's Passover Seder. Bernard Miller, now 14, will spend the next few months measuring his estrangement from family, especially his father, and from Jewry. Quote, "I had suddenly shot up, that is, in my own estimation, and it seemed to me that I towered over life. Life meant the family." Bernard's father is morose, self-lacerating, a serious man, a failure, Lionel Trilling's characterization of the father of Isaac Babel. An American Jew without a sense of intimacy with the Jewish past, without much success and still less joy in the present, with little to show for a lifetime in America except for his own indeterminacy. And then there's Bernard's grandfather, expansive, untidy, idle by American standards at least, an extravagant, pious Russian Jew who, quote, always wore carpet slippers in the house as if to show how thoroughly at home he felt. Moments of carelessness, of comfort unknown to Bernard's father. Grandfather was an improvident man who lived like a king. At the Seder, a tattooed guest, a hillbilly relative through marriage from Tennessee, inspired by the melodies, sings Bible country tunes, clapping loudly, endearing himself to the grandfather, while plunging Bernard's father into a brooding sense of displacement. He cannot appreciate melodies from the heartland of America because, Rosenfeld implies, he is so distant from his own natural home. The grandfather, on the other hand, a warm-hearted hussy, whose Chicago shtiebel is described in the novel with sympathy, can enjoy Americana precisely because he is so comfortable with his own people. Quote, "Jews in America contact with country life, with small town folk and farmers. But through cultural retention, Rosenfeld explains elsewhere, through a subliminal orientation to more primitive surroundings, they may still find in themselves access to rural life, understanding its character and traditions, end quote. Rosenfeld had read Isadora Welty. Here we encounter the assertion, rather surprising, really, in view of what Eastern Europe and Russia have meant for American Jews for much of the century, pogroms, obscurantism, that such connections deepen one's humanity, even an appreciation for the magic of the world. In a short story, The World of the Ceiling, Rosenfeld's protagonist manages to evoke, whenever he goes to the roof of his parents' apartment building, a world of intensity, a Russia of fierce, dark women, of conspirators, menacing Cossacks, rare beauty. Eventually he grows up. Quote, little by little I lost its power. I grew up, married, raised children, ran after them, wiping their noses, and thus sank deeper and deeper into reality, and as my father had predicted, into poverty. I haven't had much time to spend on the ceiling. When I step out of the house, I see no more troikas, aristocrats, and revolutionaries. The ugly, narrow, crowded street in which we live, full of smoke and noise, is an ugly, narrow, crowded street. Goodbye, Nevsky Prospect. It is, as Werner Sollers tells us in the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, from the vantage point of the roof, that the literature written by Jews on American life in the first decades of the 20th century typically sees Eastern Europe. Abraham Kahan's Ghetto, that stunning final scene in Zangwill's Melting Pot, the roof scenes in Henry Roth's lyrical Call It Sleep, even the hard-headed, anti-metaphysical socialist realist Michael Gold has his Jews without money transcend the streets and commune on the novel's rooftop. Perhaps it's for this reason that much later, Philip Roth puts Ozzie Friedman, bullied and penalized by his Hebrew teacher, on the roof of his school in the conversion of the Jews, threatening to jump if his teachers do not desist from forcing their beliefs on their students. My interest here is what they saw across the waters. My agenda is counter-chronological, prompted by a desire to understand better present-day attitudes in a historical inquiry of various, often conflicting notions of past. I use the words Russia and Eastern Europe interchangeably in this lecture, rather inaccurately, on technical grounds at least, since I traduce formal boundaries between the Russian Pale of Settlement, Poland pre- and post-war, Austria-Hungary, but in this, a study of perceptions over a century or so, formal geographical boundaries are only one of many features of old world life rendered metaphorically. I could interrogate this past in various ways. Perhaps like anthropologist Jack Kugelmas, who in a recent fascinating piece looked at Sammy's Romanian Steakhouse, a pricey Lower East Side eatery where East European Jewish traditions are parodied and also idealized by customers who don't know these traditions. Quote, Sammy's is a fabricated universe, and what it has to offer is a past that no one ever had, but many people think is theirs. Kugelmas could just as well have chosen the now annual matzah meal, mushu, and mistletoe celebration held in a San Francisco Chinese restaurant Christmas Eve, where comedians entertain with Jewish themes. A recent New York Times article lists these as hypochondria, Hebrew school, and prune juice, and an evening that ends with what the Times calls, quote, the anthem of late 20th century American yuppie jewelry, not Hatikva or the Internationale, but Sunrise Sunset. The evidence I prefer is canonized text. Fiction, a rather familiar list by Abraham Kahan, Gazierska, and others, history, the occasional anthropological study, and plays, including, of course, Fiddler on the Roof, the sturdiest source of popular contemporary wisdom on East European jewelry. There is no attempt here to survey comprehensively the preoccupations of American Jews with politics of silence, the inattentiveness, for instance, toward the East European background to American Jewish life in the work of Mordechai Kaplan, the leading American Jewish theologian, a backdrop which, as a Lithuanian rabbinic prodigy, he knew intimately. This lecture seeks to point in the direction of how to examine one crucial preoccupation of 20th century American Jewry. My primary interest is to turn to nostalgia, the use of Eastern Europe as a source of pedigree, a self-reflexive yardstick for the successes and failures of contemporary American Jewish life as seen against the backdrop of a world fixed in time, in a rarefied, obliterated place. This represents a turn from Eastern Europe as mostly a land of pogroms. Especially in the last half-century, Eastern Europe has come to remind Jews of good things, of the comfortable, reassuring joys of family, piety, community, spirituality, and unencumbered identity. In short, of a seamless way of life left behind in the rush for the bounty of social mobility. Eastern Europe remains the locus of pogroms, but now also the site of the shtetl. Few terms evoke quite so vividly for Jews the wages of modernity, what was abandoned to achieve what they now have. Alfred Hazen, writing in 1966, Jews don't believe in original sin, but they certainly believe in the original love that they knew in the shtetl, in the kitchen, in the Jewish household. This lecture explores how the Russian Jewish past emerged, especially since the Second World War, as a source of pedigree, a proof that Jews had in the past personified spirituality, wholeness, communal cohesion, perhaps also widespread scholarly distinction. A violent, unpredictable place that is also the scene of a common childhood, when faith was steady, families whole, when God favored his people. The European catastrophe, the search for identity and place in post-World War II America, the geographical dispersion of a previously urban American Jewry in the 1950s and beyond, all these, as we'll see, had their impact on perceptions of an East European Jewish past that is, needless to say, an American, not a Russian story. I do not intend to examine this literature in this lecture for its historicity. My interest is in what the narration of a collective history reveals in terms of identity and coherence, not accuracy. We examine those moments in American Jewish life where the perceptions of the world of our fathers were fixed, when the features of contemporary Jewish nostalgia first elucidated. A final introductory comment. This is an examination mostly of fiction, as a window on the perceptions of American Jews. I know how risky an enterprise this is, how selective, rarefied, idiosyncratic such evidence might appear. Still, I remain convinced that these artifacts provide something otherwise inaccessible. They shed light, I think, on preoccupations that fall otherwise between the lines. And in this vein, I cite the following passage with a recognition of its irony, even its absurdity, that splendid exchange in Malaman's novel, The Assistant. He asked her what she was reading. The idiot, do you know it? No. What is it about? It's a novel. I'd rather read the truth. It is the truth. Quote, we have to be Americans. We will be. This is from the 1916 editorial in the Yiddish Daily Forward. We will learn English. We will accommodate ourselves to the laws and organization of the country. We will interest ourselves in its politics. We will accomplish in the new world 100 times more than we could in the old, but you will not be able to erase the old world from your heart. End quote. In terms of public discourse, at least, as Eva Moravska and Ellie Letterhedler have demonstrated in path-breaking work, East United States were more frequent and, it seems, fervent. This somewhat fiercer tenor to the Americanization of Jewish immigrants can be traced to how it was less likely for Jews to feel that they had a homeland in the Slavic world to which to return, in contrast to Poles, Lithuanians, others. Still, as the forward editorial implies, commitment to life in the New World could be rather abstract or self-conscious. We have to be Americans. We will be. Attachments to the Old World could and no doubt did draw on immigrants to an extent that were at times disorienting. This is apparent even in the supposedly unambiguous celebration of assimilation in immigrant American Jewry, Mary Antin's The Promised Land. Here at the book's beginning, Antin observes how growing up in Russian Poland and Plock, when her father was away on business, his destination was described as a faraway hostile place called Russia. Of course, Plock was a part of the Russian Empire, but not in the mind of this little girl. Plock was home. It was good, comfortable, secure. And somewhere else was Russia. Quote, Russia was the place where one's father went on business. It was so far off, and so many bad things happened there. A disjuncture between good, nurturing local life and the venality of a larger, oppressive, and dangerous place. On the whole, when there were glimpses of Eastern Europe in the imaginative work on immigrant Jewish life written at the turn of the century, these were almost exclusively in terms of its poverty and pogroms. See, for instance, how Abraham Kahan's novel, a work of estimable birth that describes in the fullest detail the clothing and building trades of turn-of-the-century New York, dispenses with his hero's Russian Jewish background, his childhood and adolescence, with rare efficiency in some 80 pages. This is a striking feature of the rise of David Levinsky, since Kahan builds the book around Levinsky's yearning for home. He intends his readers to feel the poignancy of young Levinsky's encounter immediately after his arrival in the United States, when he's asked, "And what is your occupation? You have no trade, have you?" "I read Talmud," I said confusedly. "I see, but that's no business in America." Values of old and new worlds are contrasted here, yet Kahan does nothing further with the encounter and doesn't build on it to compare, for instance, the cerebral values of Levinsky's native Jewish Lithuania with the hurly-burly of materialistic America. Quite the opposite. He shows Levinsky's chief failing as an inability to move beyond such preoccupations, which for him are little more than exercises in self-indulgence. Levinsky's preoccupation with his dead mother, killed on the streets by hostile Gentiles, intrudes on all his relations with women. His yearning for a college education stops him from savoring his considerable business success. This book, invoked today mostly as a sturdy immigrant melodrama, is above all a splendid study of the inability to marshal one's desires. This preoccupation with hometown, its sounds, its synagogues, even its women, is itself a sign of malaise, a pathology at the core of the book. All is transformed by him into abstraction. America, too, as Levinsky tells it, quote, lured me chiefly as a land of mystery, of fantastic experiences, of marvelous transformations. Eastern Europe is of little importance here. It is merely a noisome, pogrom-ridden backdrop, a place from which to escape. Intimations of what Eastern Europe would later come to represent can be seen more clearly, I think, in Hutchin Hopwood's The Spirit of the Ghetto, published like The Rise of David Levinsky in 1917. Both books, Kahan himself had a considerable impact on Hopwood's work as his guide to the exotic East Side, sought to explain an immigrant community, much in the news at the time, because of the business success of some rich Jews. Hence, the attention lavished by Kahan on the mechanics of the Jewish trades in New York, where he seeks to clarify the commercial talents of Jews. Hopwood, too, a sympathetic non-Jewish journalist, sought to deflect attention from the economic achievements of a few visible rich immigrants, by concentrating on those who personify, as he saw it, the true spirit of the East Side, its scholars, writers, intellectuals. The book is an expansive, generous apologetic. The grasping, materialistic immigrant of popular culture that immigrant captured vividly in Jacob Ries's famous 1890 report is transformed. Ludlow Street meant, for Ries, the epitome of naked, unadorned materialism. In contrast, Hapgood examines the faces of old, exhausted men behind sewing machines and sees scholars from the old world, men who are highly trained and educated, who resemble uncannily the learned, shrewd patriarchs captured by Rembrandt himself. Hapgood sits in East Side cafes and admires his poets, translators, and formidable intellectuals who seek to sustain an East European legacy. This is the spirit of the ghetto. Much the same ghetto that Irving Howe would rediscover half a century later, nurtured in Russia and sustained laboriously in the United States, a rich though fragile and embattled scholarly terrain. Yet this quintessential, spiritually attuned Jewish temperament, supposedly traceable to Eastern Europe, and as many would later argue, unable to master the vicissitudes of this world precisely because it is so adept at matters of spirit, this prince of the ghetto, who comes to be so much a part of the landscape of American Jewish life in the 1950s, was barely visible at Hapgood's time. Hapgood's book must be read as a warm-hearted exercise in subversion, with its portrayal of East European Jewry posed as a counterweight to regnant stereotypes. He draws on no literary tradition, except for those he seeks to overturn. A good way, I think, to examine the transformation in regnant images of Eastern Europe over the last century is to trace the representation of Old World in the fiction of Anja Jezierska. Here, and despite the repetitiveness that is her trademark, the place she evokes in the 1950s is, as I see it, so different from her better-known work of the 1920s. In Hungry Hearts, 1920, Bread Givers, 1925, also in her novel of the 30s, All I Could Never Be, Poland is little more than a place of pogroms and brutal military conscription. The protagonist's mother in Bread Givers speaks of a beautiful tablecloth she left behind, its beauty all the more vivid against the sordid, colorless backdrop of their immigrant lives in America. Quote, "There ain't in America such beautiful things like we had at home," she declares. The intensity with which she describes her lost treasure prompts her daughter to ask why she left Europe. Why not remain behind with the splendid tablecloth? The answer is simple and fierce. Quote, "Because the Tsar of Russia. Worms should eat him. He wanted for himself free soldiers to make pogroms. He wanted to make him a common soldier, to drink vodka, to eat pig, to shoot at the people." In her writing in the 1920s, Jezierska probes, as is well known, relations between a young Jewish woman and her father, a brutal, scholarly patriarch, unwilling, no doubt unable to adapt himself to America, where he expects wife and daughters to satisfy his needs. Quote, "He rushed from me," she writes in Bread Givers, slamming the door, a defeated prophet, a Jeremiah to whom the people would not listen. End quote. In an uncomprehending immigrant milieu, his learning is little more than an expression of narcissism, indifference toward those with whom he lives. Here, his inability to adapt bears little relation to the prospects facing his daughter, except for the haunting, crippling legacy he leaves her in demeaning her attempt to better herself. In contrast, in the 1950 fictional autobiography of Jezierska, Red Ribbon on a White Horse, though here too the relationship with her father remains a central theme, there's a drastic change in tone. She insists some 30 years later, and after years of literary obscurity in the wake of a flurry of attention in the 20s, on the similarity of her values to his bookish Old World ones. These standards, she believes, have wreaked havoc with her life. And had she been different and embraced a good marriage, The first, American, brash, fluent, rather than profound, with the accumulation of wealth as its main criterion. The second is poor in worldly things, but rich in spirit, awkward and ungainly, but with these as trademarks of its superiority. The first is nurtured in a vacuous, self-absorbed new world. The second, its mere image, is shaped by the values of Eastern Europe. Jezierska charts new ground late in life, in moving beyond the exoticism of immigrant existence at the core of her writings in the 20s, where much like the work of Michael Bold, Fuchs, and others, her fiction, despite her gender-related preoccupations, was built around discrete, predictable themes, an ambivalence toward a frayed immigrant milieu that clings but no longer binds, that provides little more than a dash of color missing in the larger anonymous world, an obsession with immigrant mother and fear of father. Alfred Hazen sums up the limitations of this literature nicely. Quote, the real drama behind most Jewish novels and plays, even when they are topical and revolutionary feeling, is the contrast between the hysterical tenderness of the Oedipal relations and the world. In the beginning, there was the Jewish mother and her son. But her son grew up, and he went out in the world. He became a writer. That was the beginning of his career, and usually the end of the novel. In contrast, in Jezierska's novel of the 1950s, the standard juxtapositions of the second generation American Jewish novel, Old World, New World, European, American, parochial, universal, are traduced. The Old World emerges as a standard for sustained intelligence, for spirit, for decency. In Red Ribbon on a White Horse, this culture's treatment of women, shabby in earlier accounts by Jezierska, is barely noted. Its anti-Semitism is passed over without much comment. It is rather a source of pedigree. Pedigree for an American Jewish writer seeking solace in East European roots. Delmore Schwartz, too, preoccupied in his poetry, fiction, and essays with the tension between an otherworldly poetic idealism and materialism, links in much the same period, beginning in the late 1940s, with considerable imagination and power, claims of otherworldliness to the Jews of Eastern Europe. In the story, The World is a Wedding, he has the intellectual Israel Brown visit his student Edmund Quiche, and introduced to Quiche's East European mother, the erudite Jewish professor, and I quote, spoke with customary pace and passion, telling her about her generation, the generation which came to America from Eastern Europe between 1890 and 1914. He spoke of the causes of the departure of this generation from the Old World, the problems and tricks of the ocean liner agencies, the prospects of immigrants, the images of the new world which had inhabited their minds, end quote. As he left, Mrs. Quiche breathed a sigh of relief. Edmund turns to his mother and says, "You have just seen a genius." Her reply, "How much money does he make?" This sentence, says one of the novella's characters soon afterwards, quote, is one of the most heartbreaking sentences of our time, end quote. There, supposedly, back in Eastern Europe, such things did not occur. Such base notions were never thought. There, Judaism was characterized by unworldly and selfless women and men, guided by the rigors of a splendid, humane lore. Quote, "I am proud of my ancestors," declares a character of Delmore Schwartz's in another story, a character who identifies himself as of Russian Jewish extraction. Quote, "My ancestors, in whom I take pride, were scholars, poets, prophets, and students of God, when most of Europe worshipped sticks and stones." Not that I hold that against any of you. It's not your fault that your forebears were barbarians groveling and groping about for peace or something. It is in this respect, then, that we can locate a shift in the 1950s and 60s. It is not, as some might argue, Deborah Dashur makes this point in her work on second-generation American Jews in New York, that the past, whether East European or immigrant, was before a matter of indifference, or when pondered, simple distaste, little more than the place from which one escaped, a language no longer used, the accent hopefully shed a medley of attitudes rejected toward money, clothes, sex, or food. A milieu that marked its children with separateness and, quote, it clings to your skin, your speech, your nose, writes Irving Howe, while encouraging dreams of universalism. True, in the 5-page introduction to his 1942 study of the American literary landscape on native grounds, the title itself is telling, of course, Alfred Hazen, Son of Immigrants, uses the pronoun our, e.g. our American culture, our American literature, 27 times, according to Sidra Izrahi, who was counting. In the fiercely conflicted world out of which Hazen and his generation came, continuity was reached, as some recall, in self-disintegration. Still, most vividly in left-wing politics, where Russia was at the center of its concerns, but not only there. The Russian past was integrated before the 1950s into visions of the future, with children and parents alike sharing views of common humanity through a Russian prism. This is how Hazen, as a youth, envisioned socialism, that is, if one trusts his evocation in his memoir, Walker in the City, as an antidote to loneliness. Socialism was, as he envisioned it, one long, quintessentially Russian convivial Friday night sing-song. It would be, he then assumed, quote, one long Friday evening around the samovar, and the cut glass laden with nuts and fruits, all of us singing Suzanen, Suzanen, alle Suzanen. Then the heroes of the Russian novel, All Kind of People, sorry, would walk the world, and I, still wearing a circle-necked Russian blouse a la Tolstoy, would live forever with those I loved in that beautiful Russian country of the mind, end quote. The sensibility seemed at once so Jewish and Russian. This was true in the literary imagination as well. Dostoevskian atmospherics, writes Irving Howe, albeit with some exaggeration, were recognizable for the sons and daughters of his generation. He tells how Isaac Rosenfeld once insisted to him with mock solemnity that Chekhov was originally written in Yiddish, and that his English translator, in an effort to make him respectable, had falsified his record. Anyone with half an ear would detect the Yiddish in Chekhov in its sadness, absurdity, and humanism. Perhaps then, things East European weren't quite so absent before, surfacing in taste for literature, or cut glass, or politics, or domestic histrionics. What began to change in the 1950s, in perceptions of the Jewish past, is the ways in which Eastern European Jewish life was now resurrected in some circles as a counterweight to America. This is already clear, for instance, in Abraham Joshua Heschel's 1945 Yiddish oration, published in English as The Earth is the Lord's, where the old world was made into a locus of spirituality, communal unity, and self-abnegation. Alternately, Eastern Europe was now used as a chastisement, as in Yuzierska and Delmore Schwartz, or rather and probably as proof for continuity, a reassurance that things Jewish hadn't really changed much. The Holocaust, a heightened distance from Eastern Europe, which rendered it less intrusive and at the same time more conducive to sentimentalization. The appearance of identity as a category on the American cultural scene, which shifted Jewish self-understanding considerably, redefining Jews as a group, and I suspect, as I'll argue in a few moments, also the suburbanization of the American middle class all had their impact. By the early 1950s, Jewish life in Russia, as well as the texture of life in immigrant communities in the United States, as Norman Podhoretz noted, he was then a young literary scholar sending his first pieces to commentary, were suddenly matters of intellectual interest. He found this happy and also puzzling. Perhaps, he suggested, it was prompted by a longing for a cultural intimacy, similar to what led at the same time to a rediscovery of Walt Whitman, not so much because of talent, but as a quintessentially American voice. There was, in any event, ample proof for this turn in attitudes toward Eastern Europe. Podhoretz's observations were part of a review essay of the splendid collection of Yiddish stories edited by Irving Howe and Chaim Greenberg. It appeared in 1952. Podhoretz pointed also to the newfound popularity of Martin Huber's Hasidic Tales. The publication the same year as the Hal Greenberg anthology of what Pahoritz called a remarkable book on the anthropology of shtetl culture, Life as a People. A then popular, now forgotten review, The World of Shalom Aleichem, was on Broadway. A revival of Peretz followed soon afterwards, this time off-Broadway. Pahoritz didn't mention that this interest was now curiously disassociated from Russia. By the 1950s, Russia's awkward political connotations wouldn't permit such an emphasis, which in turn may have encouraged the depiction of a discreetly Jewish terrain, the shtetl, that small Jewish town celebrated with, as it happens, neither particular acumen nor accuracy in the 1952 book, Life as a People. One quick excursion, a glimpse at a terminal point in our tale. The dark musings of Arthur Hertzberg's widely discussed recent book, The Jews in America, which illustrates as vividly as anything written in the last several decades, albeit with splendid, bizarre touches, how an East European Jewish pedigree is invented as a locus of authenticity, an essentially static place where a large complex of lived history is distilled into an idea that haunts and is meant to inspire. Hertzberg writes, the East European ancestors of American Jews did not come to the United States to create a base for rebirth of their religion or to become the front for Israel. They came to succeed in America. Shame on them. Their Jewish commitments, including their involvements with other Jews, were ultimately bounded by this vision of themselves. The problem was that Jews kept trying to convince themselves that they had come to America for some good higher than their own success. And they kept wanting to believe that they were united by something stronger than fear and memory. Perhaps Jews so convinced themselves, perhaps not. But in Hertzberg's view, not only is their historical reconstruction incorrect, it is also perverse, in that the Jews who came to America were themselves the least likely to do anything for intellectual or spiritual reasons, since it was the best Jews who on the whole remained behind, with the worst coming here. The book takes a long-standing preoccupation, one that we've already started to trace, with pedigree in Eastern Europe, and turns it on its head. Pedigree aplenty there was there, in a place awash with spirituality, scholarship, and learning, but these, along with those who most personify these traits, remained there and were obliterated. The others, the quote-unquote masses without the classes, as he puts it, without on the whole great rabbis, writers of Hebrew, etc., spawned predictably a rather pathetic community in the United States. There are happily exceptions. The book, quite reasonably in light of its thesis, starts with a description of Hertzberg's father. I kid you not. A Baltimore hussy born in Poland who asked his son just the right question years ago, inspiring the writing of the book. Here is an isolated, brilliant example. The misplaced patriarch who produced the rare voice of reason and insight in America. Understandably, Hertzberg could not expect very many Jews to share his dark, deeply personal, and rather genetically determined vision. For others, pedigree in Eastern Europe has been understood to the extent to which it emerged as a theme in a revival of interest in the shtetl, a term that by the early 1960s was a staple of Jewish social studies. Seymour Levittman's From Shtetl to Suburb, Egon Mayer's book on Borough Park, From Suburb to Shtetl. This is, of course, most vividly demonstrated in the Broadway play, later the movie Fiddler on the Roof. The themes in Fiddler on the Roof were inspired, of course, albeit rather loosely, by Shalom Aleichem, in the names of characters, bits of dialogue, and plot structure. These were then wholly remade. What emerged as the play's author, Richard Altman, saw it, was a study, quote, of man's need to change with the times. The show, says Altman, quote, follows a downhill path, as first the traditions and then the stability of Tevye's peasant village are eroded and undermined. Tevye, he writes, is a man in a state of tradition. Curiously, the fiddler, in the title role, the show's emblem of tradition, perched predictably on the roof, is all but absent. The original actor in the role, a distinguished violinist, nearly quit in frustration with his progressively dwindling lines. What was left of him, after various rewrites, was an elusive, vague reminder of a tradition whose hold on Tevye himself is elastic at best. The fiddler follows Tevye to America. There can be little doubt who will call the shots. Stroum Lecture, whose work inspired these productions, was the most popular of Yiddish writers. But to translate the dexterous, anxious wordplay of the original Yiddish onto the American stage presented a considerable challenge, which, as it happens, the producers never tried to meet. Critics were disappointed. The cutest shtetl we've never had, said one. The play's producers admitted, after its stupendous reception, that they had feared the play might be, quote, too serious and too Jewish a disaster. Far from a disaster, it would be one of the great success stories of the American theater and would redefine for American Jews, more so than any other cultural artifact of the 1960s and beyond, the content of the Jewish past. Now, no doubt, there are many reasons for the success of Fiddler. Tevye himself, who has declaimed the need for tradition in dozens of languages, offers many different things to audiences in America and elsewhere. I saw the film version first during a research trip in Helsinki, and the audience loved it. Still, let's look at the play in terms of its representation of community and examine it alongside, as improbable as this may sound, another popular cultural artifact dating from more or less the same years, the short story by Philip Roth, Eli the Fanatic. Both seek to explore, as different as they are, the brightest and darkest aspects of Jewish community life. Both, one set in post-war suburban America, the other in turn-of-the-century Russia, are inspired, I would suggest, by similar concerns. The building of community, a prime concern in an increasingly suburban post-war America, and the consequent preoccupation with family, father, and continuity. Of course, the tales are very different. Tevye is meant to reassure, to provide his audience with the promise of continuity. In contrast, Eli the Fanatic is a tale of darkness, alienation, perhaps insanity. But then, these very juxtapositions are implicit in much of the literature on suburbia, which itself veers between these two extremes, the one serving as a warning or litmus test for the other. Is the shtetl an intrusive or inspiring presence? In Fiddler, the audience is reassured that Jews carry the shtetl with them, and this promises a healthy dose of sanity and good sense. In Eli the Fanatic, the same legacy haunts. It means perpetuating traits inconceivable for a Jewish pact with the suburbs. The dark legacy of the shtetl here is the reason for alienation, a key to that perplexing dilemma in American cultural life in the 1950s. In both, I'm convinced, suburb is the immediate backdrop, whether explicitly or not. Shtetl is alternately an inspiration or a dimmock. Tevye himself, in Fiddler, is the father of us all, or so the authors say they wish to assert, and fittingly the script is dedicated to our fathers. He is not meant simply to emulate, but what most concerns Tevye, namely his children, their marriages, his role in a mostly female world, negotiating his life in a Gentile milieu, building and sustaining community, and the wages of prestige. Quote, if I were a rich man. These concerns were remarkably familiar to a post-war suburban Jewry. Tevye represents patriarchy at its most lovable, flexible, and pragmatic. It is only when confronted with the marriage of his youngest daughter to a Gentile that he finds it impossible to adapt tradition to contemporary demands. Only then does tradition intrude rather than amuse. Here in Antefta, we have traditions for everything: how to eat, how to sleep, how to wear clothes. The mineshaft here is sweet, warm, clubby, not intrusive. At the play's end, Tevye moves on to a new place. He will adapt easily, that much is certain. He comes endowed with the requisite skills. None of these themes, interestingly, rise to the surface in the 1942 book, The World of Stroum Lecture by Maurice Samuel, the first significant book that sought to resurrect the Yiddish writer's work for an American audience by a skilled popularizer attuned to contemporary Jewish taste. The difference in emphasis between this popular book of the 1940s and Fiddler, which approached much the same terrain in the 60s, is, I think, illustrative. The extent to which Fiddler addresses, in one way or another, themes central to the literature on suburbia is striking. William White's brilliant broadside, The Organization Man, with its warnings about the suburban male commuter who loses all, including his soul. David Reisman's dark reflections on the suburban sadness, a flattened world outside the city, without fathers, without privacy or individuality. In the suburbs, the 1961 novel Revolutionary Road tells us there are no looming shadows, no gaunt silhouettes. Here Stevenson was thrashed, Eisenhower elected. Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes of ticky-tacky. Malvina Reynolds, 1963. For Jews, the post-war suburbs were the first time, the first American places of residence where they were compelled to give much thought to the building of communal life. Earlier, in so-called areas of second settlement, where Jews typically lived in urban neighborhoods that they dominated demographically as well as culturally, demands for Jewish organizational life were less pressing. Money was scarce, and the presence of Gentiles, mostly of lesser status, constituted little motivation for the launching of religious or other communal institutions. In suburbia in the 1950s, and for the first time since the mass migration at the turn of the century, significant numbers of American Jews lived in places where Gentiles were in the majority. Here they moved from ethnic communities to the cities. In the cities, to new enclaves defined largely by status. Not surprisingly, Jewish life in suburbia was, as American Jewish historian Arthur Gorin writes in a recent article in the 1950s, at the very top of the communal agenda. As the social scientist then summed up, the central preoccupations of suburban life, quote, with the included, quote, the breakup of older communities, where social identity was relatively fixed, and the mass movement into new communities, where new sources of social identity had to be created. Here, in dry sociological terminology, we find an adequate, uninspiring synopsis of what the authors of Fiddler on the Roof did to make Tevye palatable and refreshingly relevant on Broadway. He is made over into a guide to elusive patriarchy, the loosening bonds of family, faith, and community. Suburban life is, as improbable as this sounds, much like the shtetl of old, or so we are told. Quote, you can take the Jew out of the shtetl, wrote Saul Gittleman in still another book in the 1970s entitled From Shtetl to Suburbia, this one on images of family and Jewish literature, quote, but you could not take the shtetl out of the Jew. In Fiddler, this is a message of comfort. In Eli the Fanatic, it is precisely this that haunts hapless Eli Peck. Peck is soon to be a father. I'm the father, are his last words, before, at the story's end, he is carted off by hospital attendants and drugged. He is asked, as a local civic-minded attorney, to dislodge a yeshiva made up of Holocaust survivors that has taken up residence in his suburb. The yeshiva employs an apparently mute chassid, scarred irreparably by the Nazis, dressed in traditional garb with a large hat and kapota, whose walks in the town have Jews in an uproar. Quote, and a medical experiment they performed on him yet, that leaves nothing, Mr. Peck, absolutely nothing. I misunderstood. No news reached Whittington about the suit, Mr. Surratt. I thought he couldn't afford another. He can't. On his first encounter with Surratt, the wily yeshiva head, Peck arrived straight from the railroad, spent after a long commute, drained and vulnerable. A few moments in an uncomfortable chair, faced with a Holocaust survivor, Peck deflates. He has a history of nervous breakdowns. His professional bearing escapes him. His briefcase weighs him down. He finds himself eventually drawn unwittingly towards Surratt, and in particular to the chassid in the hat, his mute double, with his dead children, a refugee from murdered communities that cannot be replaced by status-conscious, pleasure-seeking Whittington. village full of friends. A synagogue where you know the feel of every seat under your pants. Where with your eyes closed, you could smell the cloth of the Torah. Surah rushed out of his chair, stirring the breeze that swept Eli's letter on the floor. At the window, he leaned out and looked beyond Woodington. Beyond Woodington. In contrast, Eli lives in a place that espouses moderation, a progressive suburban community, as his letter to the Surah states, whose members, both Jewish and Gentile, are anxious that their families live in comfort and beauty and serenity. Woodington, as Eli tells himself, in its prosperity, calm, and safety, is precisely the sort of place for which his grandparents in Poland had risked their lives. Now finally Jews had a place where families were safe, and perhaps, he muses, it is necessary to protect such blessing with toughness and numbness. He stares at the house's apricot-colored house. He stares at the town's apricot-colored houses, anticipates the birth of his firstborn, dons the suit of a chassid, and is carried away at the story's end, drugged yet unsedated. Quote, in a moment they tore off his jacket. It gave so easily, in one yank. Then a needle slid under his skin. The drug calmed his soul, but it did not touch it down where the blackness had reached. A few concluding remarks. I don't recall the word Russia mentioned much as I was growing up. Later, when I began to study the Russian language in the early 1970s, I couldn't help but see the consternation of some family and neighbors. Odd, off-balance remarks about Lee Harvey Oswald's penchant for Russian. An anxiety so off-kilter, so disproportionate, that clearly more was at stake than was articulated. I sensed even then that lingering fears of McCarthyism, and perhaps other still vaguer anxieties, lay behind the outbursts. What these might be, I could not say, and given my age, they didn't detain me. Now, though, these responses seem far from frivolous. They provide me, I think, with a key to various things left unsaid, sentences unfinished, statements of such apparently grand incoherence that no one could credit them, or so I once believed, with seriousness, shavings of the past too raw or perplexing for our second-generation American Jewish household to muster. My grandfather's townland, on my father's side, Lahishan, a dorp or village is what he and other relatives chose to call it, was destroyed, or so I was told. The information seemed incontrovertible. Everyone I knew from Lahishan agreed, and I knew a good many people. Since my grandparents were members of a formal association, a Landsmannschaft of those born in or near Lahishan, with branches in Chicago and Los Angeles that met with regularity for years. Lahishan, they explained, the place in the marshlands near Pins that had brought them together was obliterated shortly after my grandfather's exit in 1919 or 20. They said little more about it, really. Eventually, the geography of the place was rendered for me obscure when my grandfather, soon before his death in the mid-50s, told me that it was in Poland he was born, not Russia, or the Soviet Union, as I was certain he had said before. Russia, a fiercely politicized, ever more distant place, now was moved by him somewhere beyond Lahishan, and the birthplace of my father's family was gone, leveled by pogroms, its Jews decimated and scattered. Imagine my surprise when later I glanced at a road map of Belarus and noticed Lahishan, just off the main strip of highway, a small place with little to distinguish it, according to a guidebook I soon discovered, but far from annihilated. I mentioned this to an uncle, who smiled as if he wasn't much surprised, nor, for that matter, did it seem to change much. There was much that he, as well as the others, found themselves obliged to forget. Chashka, for example, a woman with a childlike face and a house far from our Jewish neighborhood, a place full of birds, flowers, and plants growing inside, a Yiddish accented bohemia. It was the first such place I'd ever seen. Chashka disappeared from our circle when she took a relative to a picnic in Griffith Park that turned out to be a Communist Party rally. Years later, I chanced upon another relative who told me that I had great uncles on the Chicago Yiddish stage. I had never heard their names before. Communists, I was told laconically when I mentioned the encounter. Lahishan had its formal Russian borders traduced. Chashka was summarily dropped. Great uncles, presumably others too, written off. My grandfather's Belarusian home itself erased by a Landsmannschaft launched, at least formally, to recall it. A past flattened, flattened into something relentlessly grim, or as incredible as the juxtaposition may seem, insipid and sweet. Recently, I read for the first time with real care the Yiddish poems and memoirs of her native Lahishan, written by my aunt and namesake Cyril Teplinski, who died 10 years before I was born and named Tzvi in her memory. Here I found that her recollections of life in Lahishan, some of which I recalled from readings after her death at our luncheon shops, were in stark contrast to the tone of the poetry. The recollections are on the whole predictable declamations about small-town Jewish life. In contrast, there are her poems, many of them written in Lahishan, found unpublished in her drawer after her death. These are complex, impressive explorations of desire, with more than a hint of sexual desires forbidden in her deeply conservative milieu. When I mentioned my impressions of the love poems to my father, her youngest brother, who still recites often and with gusto lines from Cyrilla's evocations of Ghetto life, his response was much like the reply to my discovery of Lahishan on the Belarus road map. A vague acknowledgement, an expression of unwavering confidence in the immutability of past that new evidence was unlikely to sunder. Thank you. Are there questions? There are.
Do you think you may have idealized the Jewish culture in the Ghetto in contrast to the Jewish culture developed by the
What I'm trying to describe is the construction of the question was whether I idealized. What I was trying to do was to characterize the construction of an ideal culture. I'm not ascribing to it. I'm not talking about it as historically true. I didn't grade anything I talked about today, except for Earthford, along historical lines. To be sure, what I'm describing is a profoundly idealized culture. A profoundly idealized culture where supposedly Jews, the bulk of Jews, are learned. Of course, historically, that's absurd. But it seems to me more interesting, rather than for me as a historian to stand up at the beginning of the series of lectures and excoriate, if you will, the self-understanding that American Jews have of the past, it seems to me more useful to try to understand it. And so what I try to do in this lecture is to try to lend some coherence to constructions about the past. And in the following lectures, we actually turn to Russian Jewry and talk more about history and less about construction. But it seemed to me, in talking to an American audience, and perhaps with preponderance of American Jews, and probably with preponderance of American Jews of East European descent, I want to take on the challenge of trying to lend some coherence to constructions, as you correctly said, to idealized constructions of past.
Eli was dramatic, uniquely product of its time, which could not be written
So
in
we
the
all.
90s. We have Palo Alto where there are Orthodox Jews, Kippot, and Chabad movement so strong. In a sense, I wonder, not as a historian, or as an observer of the scene, have we, in a sense, recreated part of the shtetl from our nostalgia of the 60s and brought it
And I don't know that, that Soviet Jewry, as a post-revolutionary phenomenon, really begins to intrude on the American Jewish imagination, except for very, very discreet circles, really up until the late 60s and the 70s. So I'm not sure that would be a factor. But just to rephrase your question a bit, what I was trying to suggest was the ways in which one of our great cultural artifacts, Fiddler on the Roof, is actually written, consciously not, as a guide to how to live in the suburbs. In other words, that Stroum Lecture is recast, Tevye is recast as a guide to how to live in the suburbs, suburbs of the 1960s. And not to be reductionist, to be sure, it didn't reveal more than that, but it seems to me useful to look at this text through those eyes, and then you see new things. No doubt there are a plethora of other questions that can be asked in text that can reveal other things.
I'm interested in your comments about pedigree, and I'm wondering if you were making a distinction between two generations and saying that this question of pedigree becomes more important post-Holocaust or post-World War II, and whether you think it doesn't really pertain to the immigrant, to the teens and 20s.
I don't know what pedigree would be.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of Jewish immigrant women who were associated with socialist movements and the labor movement. And I see in the 19-teens an invocation of pedigree vis-a-vis when Jewish immigrant daughters who were organizing in the garment industry talked about American women. They talked about them as only concerned with men and dances. And the pedigree came with the association between Jews and Old World struggles and New World struggles, in the sense in which the pedigree was steeped in the struggles of survival in the Old World and the bringing of that struggle to the New World.
How would that compare with other working class women?
Right, but I think that there's something interesting going on there with pedigree, too.
I'm certainly willing to be convinced of that. I didn't see evidence of that in the 20s and 30s, but perhaps in the spirit of Jewish studies it exists. I'm certainly willing to be convinced. Yes.
I know you said a lot of the material wasn't necessarily accurate historically. The comments you made relative to the more scholarly, religious, seriously spiritual Jews remaining in Eastern Europe.
I didn't make those. I was discussing the work of Arthur Hertzberg, his book, The Jews of America, which is a book haunted by the Jews of Eastern Europe. And I was trying to, as subtly as I possibly could, express disdain for what he was saying, but please continue.
Okay, I was wondering,
Because I do
feeling about the authenticity of that, and that basically the more superficial appearance of their religion and so on, more just into money and success. Those were the Jews that came to this country rather than the ones interested in preserving this sacred history.
See, what, I mean, there could ask all kinds of questions about what Jews gave and what Jews didn't. And Hertzberg's characterization is incredibly flattened, it's incredibly reductionist, it's absolutely unpersuasive, but I prefer not to talk about that right now. What interests me more is the resonance of these explanations. In other words, why is it that cultural explanations, that historical explanations of these sorts resonate? Why do they resonate? In other words, why is it that historically inaccurate explanations resonate? What I'm trying to suggest in this talk is that it seems to me historians like myself ought to go beyond the point where we've been for years in looking around at our community and saying, gosh, they don't understand us. Gosh, they don't read us. It's dreadful that their collective memory is so different from the kind of work that we create in our historical works. Yes, perhaps all that is true. But another interesting question is to actually look around immediate terrain. In other words, to understand the coherence of historical explanations that might be different from mine, but to try to understand better what makes them persuasive, and hence you're able to better read between the lines. You're better able to understand the immediate world around you. You're better able to understand contemporary Jewry. So Hertzberg's explanation hit me as a kind of explanation at the far extreme, the far spectrum, at the end of the spectrum, the most extraordinarily bizarre use of the category of pedigree in order to explain the disjuncture between East European and American Jewry. And that's why I'm interested.
What would you predict for the nostalgia of the current massive wave of immigrants from the regions you're talking about?
As I say, I'm not being utterly facetious, I really do plan to return to issues of nostalgia in the third lecture. Is this unfair because the crowd comes to this lecture and the third lecture, I'll just be talking to my immediate I don't know the midline on my phone. But if that proves to be true and you come back in the second lecture, why don't you ask it then? But I'm going to return to issues of nostalgia and the ways in which nostalgia intrudes on the historical imagination in the third lecture, where I hope to try to again introduce the distinction so common in circles like mine, where it's we who write history, and it's poor people like you who suffer from nostalgia. And it seems to me that nostalgia of various sorts informs Jewish historical work and other historical work. And I'm going to try to look at some of that rather closely in work on Russian Jewry in the third lecture. So could I? Yes.